Sometime before sunrise on June 10th, 1912, a small Midwest city changed forever. A family of 6 and their 2 young sleepover guests were murdered in the night. It's a crime that's almost unspeakable, and one of America's most infamous. But even after more than 100 years, the mystery of what really happened that night endures to this day. This is the story of the Villisca axe murders. The Nottoway River stretches from the border between Missouri and Kansas all the way into Iowa, where it forks to become 2 rivers. Just north of that junction is a small city whose first settlers showed up around 1850. And for the first few years of its existence, there were only a handful of families that lived there, the Forks, as the city was initially called. That changed when a railroad official named D.N. Smith came in and officially established the city. And with a new beginning came a new name. One Smith picked out himself. Using the language spoken by the Native Americans living in the area as inspiration, Smith chose the word Villisca, which translated to pretty place or pleasant view. The problem was, the word had a variety of meanings depending on context, and one of them was evil spirit. The new name spooked many of its residents, but it stuck, and the city is known by the same name today, Villisca, Iowa. It would only take a few decades for the more ominous translation to become more appropriate. In the early evening of Sunday, June 9th, 1912, the Moore family of Villisca walked together to the Presbyterian church they attended. Josiah Moore, a prominent 43-year-old businessman, owned an implement store and was well respected in the community. His wife Sarah was 39 and had her hands full raising 4 children ranging in age from 5 to 11 years old: Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. Tagging along with them that evening were Ina May and Lena Stillinger, the young daughters of a wealthy Villisca farmer and friends of the Moore children. The group of 8 were heading to a Children's Day program at the church to celebrate the end of the Sunday school year. Sarah tirelessly organized the event for weeks, and she was both relieved and excited that the day was finally here. The program went off without a hitch. There were guest speakers, and the children recited nursery rhymes and sang hymns to a crowd of proud parents. When the program was done, everyone mixed and mingled for a while before heading home. By the time the Moores walked the 3 blocks back to their quaint little house, it was already 9:45. The Moore residence was a 2-story white frame structure that was built in 1868. Josiah purchased it in 1903 and, along with Sarah, turned it from just a house into a loving family home. It was a rare find, too. Not many houses built in the 1860s had a second floor. Upstairs was a master bedroom for Josiah and Sarah, and a second bedroom was shared by their children. The downstairs included a parlor, which is a formal living space, a kitchen, and a 3rd bedroom that doubled as a sewing room, which is where the Stillinger girls would spend the night of June 9th. When they arrived back home, Sarah served the children cookies and milk before tucking each of them in with a kiss and wishes for a good night. Soon after, Josiah and Sarah settled into bed themselves, and by midnight, the house was silent. As the sun peeked over the horizon and daylight spread across Villisca that morning, Mary Peckham, a neighbor of the Moores, noticed something peculiar. Without fail, every morning she was greeted by the sight of the Moore children performing their morning chores. But there was no activity outside on the morning of June 10th. The Moores' horses were still in the stable and had taken to loudly neighing as if to protest their lack of breakfast. Mary walked to the Moores' front door around 7 o'clock and knocked with no answer. She tried to listen for them, but she couldn't detect even a faint din through the door. This was also strange. With 4 children, there wasn't a whole lot of quiet when the family was home. She knocked again with the same result, and then returned home to call Josiah's brother Ross. When he arrived and his knocks went unanswered, he fished in his pocket for a spare key and opened the door. The moment Ross set foot in the house, the silence was screaming, and it set an eerie mood. The entire downstairs was still dark, too. When he looked around, Ross noticed that there were sheets and bedclothes covering the windows. He took slow steps into the parlor and called out for Josiah, hoping to hear anything that would break the concerning silence, but he received no response. Directly across from him on the back wall of the parlor was a door to the bedroom where the Stillinger girls slept, and to his right was the kitchen. When he glanced into the kitchen, he was puzzled to see a single plate of food left untouched on the table. It wasn't like Sarah to leave food out and dishes dirty. Ross continued toward the door for the downstairs bedroom and pushed it open. What he saw sent him running out of the house. Ross hurried to Mary's house and called the hardware store that Josiah owned. He barked an order to the clerk who answered to find Villisca Marshal Hank Horton and send him to Josiah's house right away. Marshal Horton arrived around 8:30, followed shortly by 3 doctors, the coroner, and the Moores Presbyterian minister. The men entered the house as a crowd started to form outside and speculate on all the commotion. After a thorough examination of the house, they looked traumatized when they came back out. One of the doctors was noticeably pale and was overheard telling a small group not to go inside because they'll regret it for the rest of their days. What they saw was all 6 members of the Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls lying dead in their beds. All 8 of them had been bludgeoned with an axe. It was a gruesome scene, and a distinctly odd one, too. In addition to the windows being covered by sheets and bedclothes, all the mirrors in the house were covered too. On the floor in the Stillinger girls' room was a burning lamp with its chimney set next to it, and an axe leaning against the wall next to that, smeared with blood. Whoever used it had wiped it down poorly, making it clear that it was what caused all the destruction in the house. Also on the floor of the downstairs bedroom was a linen tied with string. Inside it was a 4-pound slab of uncooked bacon. On the table in the kitchen, next to the plate of untouched food, was a bowl full of pink-tinged water, indicating that whoever did this washed up before leaving. The burnt remains of a shredded legal document were found in the wood-burning stove, and a spot of blood was found near the front door handle, indicating where the killer exited. Strangely, the killer took the time to lock the door upon leaving. The coroner believed that the killings took place between midnight and 5 a.m., as a more specific time of death couldn't be determined. Each of the victims had been hit 20 to 30 times in the face with the very same axe that was left leaning against the wall in the downstairs bedroom, and the very same axe that Josiah owned and kept in the barn out back. 7 of the victims were murdered with the blunt side of the axe, but not Josiah. He got the blade, and the swings that killed him were so vicious and forceful that the murderer left gouges in the ceiling on his backswings. The other bodies in the house held clues too. Only one of the victims showed any signs of waking up during the attack. Lena Stillinger had defensive wounds on her arms, and her nightgown had been pulled up, exposing the lower half of her naked body and leading police to wonder if she was assaulted. It was later determined that Lena fought for her life and that her nightgown was disheveled as a result of that effort. It was puzzling, however, that none of the other bodies had similar wounds. Josiah and Sarah occupied the same bed, and their 4 children shared the same bedroom. In terms of noise, an axe impact isn't the same as a gunshot, for example, but bludgeoning another human being wouldn't exactly be a quiet affair either. It's customary in murder investigations to carefully control the crime scene. An area is usually taped off, and foot traffic is both limited and recorded in the case file, while investigators carefully secure evidence inside. Villisca was a small Midwest town with 1 marshal, though, and it wasn't a place that required many murder investigations. In a move that would have today's detectives falling out of their respective chairs, Marshal Horton decided to open up the crime scene to whoever wanted to view it. Despite one of the doctor's warnings about not going in, there were plenty of eager citizens among the crowd outside who wanted to see what happened for themselves. The bodies had not been removed either. Marshal Horton did this to solicit theories from the public after they examined the house. Believing it could help put people in the killer's state of mind, anyone who wanted to was allowed to handle the axe. By the time the last Villisca resident left the home, more than 100 people had traipsed through it, touched about every surface, And most importantly, ruined the possibility of pulling the killer's fingerprints off the axe. When the bodies were removed, it was discovered that some of the visitors took pieces of Josiah's skull as a sort of macabre souvenir. All of this was much more than Marshall Horton imagined when he started inviting people into the house, and the National Guard eventually showed up to maintain order and cordon off the crime scene. As if that wasn't bad enough, there were few witnesses that came forward with any information that might lead Marshall Horton to the murderer, and very little of the evidence pointed in any one direction. Considering the state of the evidence after almost the entire town walked through the house, the killer could have been any man, woman, or child in Villisca at the time of the murders. Not only that, by the time the investigation at the house wrapped up, the murderer at worst would have had a 5-hour head start. With more than 30 trains running through Villisca at all hours of the day, the killer could have easily been hundreds of miles away by now. Bloodhounds were brought to the scene, and while initially unsuccessful, they managed to pick up a trail from the house to the Nottoway River, and that's where it disappeared. The dogs were brought back to the house the next day, and once again they led police to the same spot in the river. It was possible for the killer to use the river as a means to escape, but it was impossible to be certain without any other evidence. It was the only thing Marshall Horton had to go on, and if someone escaped using the river, it would most likely be a transient that came to town by train. Marshall Horton had anyone even remotely unfamiliar in town rounded up, detained, questioned, and logged as potential suspects. Again, with that many trains running through Villisca, there were more than a few freight hoppers in town at the time, so he had his work cut out for him. While that was going on, he reached out to one of the leading fingerprint experts in the Midwest at the time named William McLowry, and he came to Villisca to examine the house. Things didn't exactly get off to a great start when he got off the train completely hammered, though. When he sobered up and analyzed the crime scene, there were no viable fingerprints found. He did examine the rest of the scene, including blood spatter and the axe holes in the ceiling, and concluded that when the Stillinger girls were killed, the murderer was like a piranha in a frenzy, swinging the axe wildly over his head with just one arm. McLowry also believed the killer was left-handed based on the blood spatter patterns. And that's about where the trail of the Villisca axe murderer goes cold. So all we have is speculation. Much like the unsolved Jack the Ripper murders that occurred in Whitechapel, England 20 years before Villisca, there's no shortage of suspects in the Villisca axe murders. There are far too many to present here, but there are some interesting facts surrounding some. Like Andrew Sawyer, a transient who always slept fully clothed and with an axe next to his bed. It was later determined he was arrested in Osceola, Iowa, 70 miles from Villisca, around 11 o'clock on the night of the murders. A state senator and rival businessman named Frank Jones was a person of interest in the case before being ruled out. Josiah's own brother-in-law, Sam Moyer, threatened to kill him several times as a rumor was going around that Josiah was having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. This, of course, upset Moyer and Jones, but there was never any evidence to suggest this was true. No one suspect is a perfect fit for the crime, but there are two that are more than a little interesting. We'll start with Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher from England who came to the United States about a decade before the murders. He lived and did much of his preaching in Macedonia, Iowa, but at the time of the slayings, he was a student at the Presbyterian Seminary in Omaha. On the night of the murders, however, he was in Villisca. Despite his profession, Kelly was no saint. It was well known that he was a deviant with a history of mental illness and a peeping Tom. 2 nights before the murders, Kelly was caught peering into Villisca windows. He attended the Children's Day program that Sarah organized, and he may have taken a shine to her or the children while he was there. After the service, Kelly was taken to the minister's house to stay the night and shown his room around 10:30. Kelly was slated to leave Villisca on the 5:19 train, so he'd be gone by the time his host woke up on the morning of June 10th. While at the train station waiting to depart, Kelly spoke to a couple and told them about the 8 people bludgeoned to death overnight. But that was hours before the bodies were discovered. In Macedonia later that morning around 8:30,
Kelly told a friend about the murders and claimed to have even heard the sound of the axe contacting the skulls of the victims. By that time, however, news of the murders was only just getting around Villisca. Another witness claims Kelly said that whoever committed the murders went to the house around 1 o'clock in the morning, and even that the killer had to hide on the back porch in the middle of the act, as people were heard on the street passing by the house. On June 12th or 13th, a package of laundry was delivered to a dry cleaner in Council Bluffs, Iowa, without a name attached. There was only a note that requested the laundry be returned to Macedonia when it was finished. Inside the package was a shirt that appeared to have already been washed, but significant bloodstains remained. As instructed, the laundry was done and sent to Macedonia, where none other than Kelly picked it up. The drugstore that received it reported that he had come by several times in those days after the murders to see if his laundry had arrived yet. 2 weeks later, Kelly returned to Villisca and asked the Presbyterian minister he stayed with to arrange a tour of the Moore house for him. Since investigators were going to be at the house when Kelly was in town, he got to go in and have a look around. Kelly ran into trouble with the law in 1913. He took out a want ad in the Omaha newspaper seeking a stenographer to be a model for photos that Kelly said he was using in a book he was writing. After a woman replied to the ad with questions, Kelly wrote back a letter so lewd and obscene that he'd be arrested for indecency. Among the job requirements he listed, typing in the nude was one of them. After he was arrested and jailed, Kelly was accused of several revolting, immoral acts that he attempted on fellow prisoners, and detectives found him to be belligerent and profane, causing them a great deal of trouble during his interrogation. Kelly would be deemed insane, and he was sent to a federal mental hospital in Washington, D.C. by a judge. While there, Kelly was prone to violent fits, aggressive profanity, and attempts to hurt others. In perhaps the oddest report from his stay there, Kelly was found to be keeping portions of meat and other food from meals either on him or in his room. If a pork chop in his pocket wasn't enough, he had no plans to eat any of the food he either wore or stored away. He spent 8 months as a patient there before being released and returning to Iowa. The biggest reason to suspect Kelly as the Villisca axe murderer, though, was that he confessed. Twice. While being held for indecency, he told a jailer that he committed the Villisca murders, and he later confessed to a U.S. Marshal. A statement of confession was written by Kelly and signed. In it, he wrote,
"I killed the children upstairs first and the children downstairs last. I knew God wanted me to do it this way. Slay utterly came to mind, and I picked up the axe and went into the house and killed them."
In both of his confessions, he later recanted his admission, but that didn't stop him from being indicted by a grand jury and put on trial. This caused members of the prosecution team to jump the gun a bit and tell reporters that the Villisca case was solved. They believed they had a wealth of evidence that proved Kelly committed the murders, and even referred to the case against him as airtight. The defense was just as confident, calling Kelly a scapegoat to shield another man. The reason he took such an interest in the case, according to his lawyer, was because he had experience at Scotland Yard, which is the headquarters for the Metropolitan Police in London. Kelly apparently believed he could help the investigation. One argument the defense had that would be difficult for the prosecution to tackle was that the evidence against Kelly was largely circumstantial. They had a point. Kelly was left-handed and known to be mentally ill, but that didn't make him a killer. The closest piece of evidence that pointed to Kelly was the bloody shirt, but that didn't necessarily place him at the Moore's house at the time of the murders either. There was no hard evidence at the house or in Kelly's possession that could conclusively prove he was the killer. No fingerprints, no souvenirs, nothing. But when the case was handed to the jury, they couldn't come to a unanimous decision. The judge dismissed the jury and declared a mistrial. About 6 weeks later, a second trial of Kelly got underway. This time, his confession would not be entered into evidence, as the defense claimed it was coerced through physical intimidation by police. Kelly's first trial took 24 days, but his second took half of that. This time, the jury was unanimous. Kelly was not guilty.
Starting in the fall of 1911, a series of brutal murders took place every 2 weeks beginning on September 17th. In each of the murders, entire families were wiped out. Most of the victims were bludgeoned with an axe, but that's far from the only thread that connected the cases. On September 17th, 2 Colorado Springs families who lived next door to one another were all killed with an axe as they slept. A family of 3 was murdered in Monmouth, Illinois, and at the crime scene, the windows were covered, the bodies were covered, and the 13-year-old daughter was the only victim who seemed to have awakened before or during the attack. In October, a family of 5 was murdered as they slept in Ellsworth, Kansas. They were killed with an axe that was left leaning against the wall, and a lamp was left at the foot of the parents' bed with its chimney removed. All the bodies were covered in bedclothes. There was then a period of dormancy, but on June 5th, just 5 days before the Moores and Stillinger girls were found dead, a couple was murdered. The victims had recently moved there from Ohio and didn't have any children, but it appeared that an axe or a mason's hammer was used to kill them. The victims were all covered, and there was no clear motive. The resemblance to the Villisca murders is undeniable, and there are only a few exceptions. All of the murders took place near railroads. All of the murders took place in small towns with few police officers. The families all had barns where the killer likely hid and observed his victims for a while before committing the crimes. In only one of the murders was the weapon not left behind at the scene. 3 of the murders took place on a Sunday. None of the families had dogs that could warn of an intruder. In the axe murders, the blunt side was used to kill the victims. The murder weapon always belonged to the property owners. The victims and windows were covered in blankets, bedclothes, or curtains. In all of the murders, an oil lamp was found at each scene with the chimney removed and its wick turned down low. The adult and male victims in the house were always clearly killed while sleeping, but the young girls sometimes showed signs of defensive wounds. There were no signs of robbery as a motive. The killer remained behind at the scene for some time after the murders. He would often eat and clean the blood off his hands, and he usually wiped down the axe. At least one of the female victims was touched or posed in a sexual way, and the killer always locked the door when he left. In recent years, a German immigrant and a known axe murderer named Paul Muller has been floated as a suspect. He was the only suspect in an axe murder of a family who employed him as a farmhand in the late 1890s. At that crime scene, it was determined that the killer used the blunt side of the axe to bludgeon the family. He also covered the face of his employer and posed 2 of the female bodies in suggestive positions and even mutilated them. He was known to be in America at the time and could have possibly been responsible for a string of axe murders in Germany. But the signatures of the 1911 and 1912 murders were absent. There was no oil lamp found, he didn't cover the windows, he robbed them, and before he fled, he set the house on fire. It was also determined that he drugged his victims before committing the murders. But could that be evidence that supports Muller as a suspect for the Villisca murders? One of the biggest questions about the 1911 and 1912 murders is why so few of the victims woke up before being attacked. There have been theories lobbed up before, like the potential of there being multiple killers, but if we look at the Villisca murders, we see that this wouldn't answer the question completely. The greatest opportunity for any of the victims to wake up was in the Moore children's bedroom. There were 4 of them sleeping in there, and unless there were 4 murderers, it's puzzling that there were no signs of any of the children in that room waking up. Lena clearly woke up either before or during her attack, and there were a few victims at the other crime scenes who appeared to have defensive wounds as well. If the families were drugged before the killer struck, however, it could explain why very few of them were awakened by the attacks. Still, there are many other gaping holes in this case that no one fully fits into, and the mystery of who killed the Villisca 8 endures. In the 100-plus years since the Villisca murders, what happened at the Moore residence has become synonymous with the city's name. It's woven into the fabric of Villisca. The Moore house still stands, and although it was remodeled over the years, one set of owners in the 1990s restored it to its original floor plan. The house itself has taken on a new identity in recent decades too, as purportedly one of the most haunted houses in America. It's become a favorite location for ghost hunting television shows and YouTube channels, and today, a large sign in the front yard reads, Villisca Axe Murder House. It's open for tours, so you can see where the murders took place and learn about the facts surrounding that night in 1912. That's not all. The house was recently bought by the U.S. Ghost Adventures Tour Company, and you can book an overnight stay and conduct a murder or paranormal investigation of your own. Who do you think killed the Villisca 8? Was it one of the suspects mentioned here, or maybe somebody else? Let's talk about it in the comments. Before you take off, if you'd be so kind as to leave a like or even subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you for spending some time going back in time with me, and I hope to see you back here for more chilling history.